When the last train on the abandoned rail line let out its mournful whistle for the final time in 15 years, carrying in its dusty carriages not only passengers forgotten by progress, but also the resurrected dreams of an entire town, Michael Santos knew his silent battle against time and greed had been worth every tear shed in secret. But to understand how a simple retired train engineer, 62 years old, managed to resurrect a doomed railway from the ashes, we must go back in time to that frigid March morning when it all began. 6 months earlier, Michael walked through the abandoned Havenwood station, as he had every morning for the past 3 years since his retirement. It was a ritual his daughter considered a morbid obsession, but for him it was a way to keep alive the memory of the times when this place pulsed with life. The echo of his footsteps reverberated through the empty halls, where once hurried voices, children's laughter, and the constant rumble of wheels on tracks had echoed. The station had been deactivated 15 years ago when the railway company decided it was no longer profitable to maintain the line connecting Havenwood to neighboring towns. As a result, the town of 8,000 inhabitants became isolated, dependent only on the precarious dirt roads that became impassable during rain. Local businesses withered, young people migrated to urban centers, and what remained was an aging community, resigned to oblivion. That particular morning, Michael found something different. Sitting on the bench of the main platform was a man in an impeccable suit, holding a leather briefcase and looking around with the thinly veiled disdain of someone who considers it all a waste of time. Beside him, a middle-aged woman took notes on a tablet, completely ignoring the melancholic beauty of the place. "You must be the retired engineer," the man said, rising with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Robert Miller from Horizon New Construction, and this is architect Sandra Lee." Michael nodded cautiously. He had heard rumors in town about a company interested in buying the old railway land, but he never imagined anyone would come in person. "Mr. Santos, I'll be direct," Robert continued, adjusting his tie. "We've purchased the rights to this property. We're going to build a modern shopping mall here, with a movie theater, food court, designer stores. It will be the largest development in the region." Michael's heart sank. "And the railway?" "Oh, Mr. Santos," Sandra laughed, without looking up from her tablet. "This rusty junk is useless. The tracks will be removed. Obviously. Progress doesn't wait for sentimentality." Sentimentality? Michael felt his blood rise. "This railway connected families for generations. My wife came here on this line when we got married. I took my daughter to the city doctor on this train when she was little. You have no idea what you're destroying." Robert chuckled condescendingly. "I understand your nostalgia, Mr. Santos, but this is the past. People today want convenience, modernity. They won't miss an obsolete railway." Michael looked around, seeing with the eyes of memory the carriages full of workers returning home, families picnicking on the platform on Sundays, lovers saying goodbye on the station stairs. How could he explain to those people that there wasn't just iron and concrete here, but the soul of a community? "Are you sure the population supports this project?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We conducted a survey," Sandra replied, finally looking at him. 80% of those surveyed approve of the shopping mall idea. People want jobs, they want development. Michael knew it was no use arguing. These people had already made their decision, and sentimental arguments wouldn't change signed contracts and approved projects. But as he walked back home, an idea began to germinate in his mind. If he couldn't stop the demolition with words, maybe he could do it another way. That night, Michael could barely sleep. He sat on the porch of his simple house, looking at the starry sky and remembering the stories his grandfather told about the first trains that arrived in the region. His grandfather had been one of the workers who built that railway line, working sunup to sundown for years to connect Havenwood to the world. "A train isn't just a means of transportation, boy," the old man used to say. "It's a bridge between dreams." 5 months earlier, the idea that had been born in Michael's mind, that sleepless night, began to take shape when he sought out Helen, the retired librarian, who knew the town's history better than anyone. Helen was 75 years old, with hair as white as cotton, and a memory that functioned like a living archive of Havenwood. "Michael, my dear," she said, serving coffee in delicate porcelain cups in her house, full of books and old photographs. You're talking about reactivating the railway. That's impossible. The costs, the bureaucracy. Helen, do you remember the story of the ghost train? The old woman's eyes lit up. How could I forget? My father told me that story dozens of times. Michael smiled. The legend of the ghost train was one of the oldest in the region. They said that during the construction of the railway in the 1930s, one of the workers had hidden a small locomotive in the middle of the woods to protect it from an accident he had foreseen in a dream. The train had never been found, but the legend said it was still there, waiting for the right moment to return to the tracks. What if the legend is true, Helen? What if there really is a hidden locomotive somewhere in the woods? Michael, even if it existed, it would be impossible to make it work after so many years. But what if it worked? What if we could get at least one car rolling on the tracks? Not forever, just enough to show people that the railway still has life. Helen was silent for a long moment, stirring her coffee without drinking. Finally, she got up and went to a dusty bookshelf, from which she took an old map of the region. If you're serious, Michael, you need to talk to your friend Jed, the blacksmith. He's the only one in town who still understands old machinery, and also with Miss Anna, who's organizing a project on local history with her students. Michael felt a spark of hope. Do you think they would help me? I think you'd be surprised how many people in this town still cherish our old railway, Helen replied, smiling for the first time since the conversation began. 4 months earlier, Jed's workshop was in the back of his house, a shed full of old tools, machine parts, and the characteristic smell of oil and metal. Jed was 58 years old, had large calloused hands, and the patience of someone who had learned that some things cannot be rushed. Have you lost your mind, Michael? Was his first reaction when Michael told him the plan. Getting a locomotive running after decades of abandonment. That's something out of a movie. Jed, you've fixed tractors that everyone said were beyond repair. You've made car engines run with only improvised parts. If anyone can perform this miracle, it's you. Jed shook his head, but Michael noticed he wasn't saying no. It was the posture of a man considering an absurd possibility that nonetheless piqued his curiosity. First, you'd have to find this so-called locomotive. Second, you'd have to assess its condition. Third, you'd have to get parts, or improvise substitutes. Fourth, you'd have to test the tracks to see if they can handle the weight. Fifth, Jed, interrupted Michael, are you listing problems or project steps? The blacksmith laughed in spite of himself. Damn it, Michael, you know me too well. That's how the search for the ghost train began. Michael, Jed, and a small group of volunteers spent the following weekends exploring the abandoned old railways, following old maps and vague clues left by stories told from generation to generation. They found the locomotive 3 weeks later, in a hidden clearing in the woods, covered in vines and half swallowed by vegetation. It was smaller than Michael expected, a compact machine from the 1940s, with peeling paint and metal corroded by time, but still recognizable in its basic shapes. My God, Jed whispered, running his hand along the rusty side, it really exists. The locomotive was in deplorable condition, but Jed discovered that the engine was still intact, protected by a makeshift cover that someone had placed decades ago. It was as if the legendary worker had truly prepared that machine to be found in the future. It'll be a lot of work, Jed said, examining the parts one by one. A lot of work, and it'll need money for parts and fuel. How much? Michael asked, though he knew his small retirement barely covered his basic needs. About $3,000–4,000, at least. Michael felt his heart sink. It was more money than he could possibly raise, but he couldn't give up now. Not when they had found the locomotive, not when hope was beginning to take shape. 3 months earlier, the solution came from where Michael least expected. Miss Anna Louisa, 32 years old, had learned about the project through Helen and approached Michael with a proposal. Mr. Michael, my students are doing a project on local history, and they were fascinated by the story of the ghost train. What if we turn this into a school project? Michael looked at the young teacher with her bright eyes and infectious energy, and felt that something was changing. How so, Miss Anna? Well, we can organize events to raise funds, an antique fair, theatrical performances about the history of the railway, selling homemade food. Parents can help, the community can participate. That way you get the money, and we get to involve the whole town in the project. The idea was brilliant. In a matter of weeks, the locomotive project ceased to be the obsession of an old retiree and became a community movement. The elementary school children drew trains in their writing assignments. The teenagers created a social media group called Save Our Railway. The adults began to organize work parties to clean the tracks and the old station. The first event was a cultural night at the school, where elderly people told stories about the golden age of the railway. Michael was thrilled to see how memories flowed, how each person had a special memory connected to those tracks. Mrs. Rose remembered when she met her husband on the train. Mr. Anthony talked about the trips he made to sell his products in neighboring town. Retired teacher Clara recalled the school trips she organized, taking children by train to visit museums in larger cities. And it was that night that Michael realized something fundamental. The railway wasn't just important to him. It was part of the collective identity of that community, a symbol of connection and belonging that modernity had tried to erase, but that still lived in the hearts of the people. The events multiplied. There was a charity bingo, a homemade food festival, a school band performance, an exhibition of old photographs. With each event, more money was raised, more people got involved, and the news spread further. That's when Robert Miller returned to town. 2 months earlier. "Mr. Michael, we need to talk," Robert said, appearing at Michael's door on a rainy afternoon. This time, he was alone and seemed much less confident than on his first visit. "Come in, Mr. Robert. Would you like some coffee?" "No, thank you. I'll be direct. I hear you're trying to reactivate the railway. You need to understand this is a waste of time. The mall is going to be built. The contracts are signed." Michael poured himself some coffee, took a sip, and looked calmly at the businessman. "No one is trying to stop your mall, Mr. Miller. We just want to show that the railway still has value for this community. Sentimental value doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Santos. It doesn't create jobs. People need to be practical. And have you asked the people what they really want?" Robert nervously chuckled. "Of course we did. We conducted a survey where you offered jobs in exchange for support of the project." The ensuing silence was telling. Michael continued, calmly but firmly, "You know, Mr. Miller, I also did some research. I spoke personally with over 200 families in this town, and I discovered something interesting." Robert waited, visibly uncomfortable. "People aren't against development. They just want development that respects our history, our identity. They want jobs, yes, but not at any cost. Mr. Santos, this is romanticizing. Business is business. Perhaps that's why you don't understand what's happening here." That week, Michael discovered something that completely changed his perspective on the whole situation. Talking to a friend who worked at the city hall, he learned that Horizon New Construction had lied about buying the rights to the railway. In fact, they had only made a purchase offer, which had not yet been accepted by the railway company that owned the tracks. The information reached Michael on a rainy Thursday, and on Friday he was already in the state capitol, at the railway company's office, talking to the manager responsible for the deactivated properties. "Mr. Santos," said the manager, a man in his 40s with glasses and the air of someone always too busy, "the construction company's offer is very good. They want to pay cash, no complications. What if I made a counteroffer?" "With all due respect, Mr. Santos, do you have the means to compete with a construction company?" Michael took a deep breath. "Not alone, but I represent a community of 8,000 people who want to preserve their history and reactivate this railway line." The manager laughed. "Reactivate, Mr. Santos, that would cost millions of dollars. Technical inspections, track repairs, new trains, government authorizations. I'm not talking about commercial reactivation, I'm talking about a cultural and tourist project. historic trains running on some sections, educational visits, heritage preservation. The man stopped laughing. That's different. It would be a kind of railway museum, exactly, with the potential to attract tourists, generate income for the community, and at the same time preserve an important historical heritage. Michael left that meeting with something he hadn't expected, a proposal to study the feasibility of his project. The railway company would give him and the community 6 months to present a concrete plan and raise the necessary funds for the first phase of the project. It was an opportunity, but also a race against time. If they couldn't prove the project was viable within that time frame, the railway would be sold to the construction company. It was at this moment that Michael realized he was no longer just fighting to save some rusty tracks. He was fighting for the soul of his community, for the possibility of showing that progress doesn't have to mean forgetting the past. And that's when he decided to tell the whole town about the challenge they faced. If you're following this story and identify with Michael's struggle, be sure to subscribe to our channel to continue receiving exciting reports like this, which show how ordinary people can make extraordinary differences. 1 month earlier, the meeting at the town hall was the largest Havenwood had seen in years. The gymnasium was packed, with people even standing in the hallways. Michael was nervous. He had never spoken to so many people, but he knew this was the time to be completely honest about the situation. "Folks," he began, his voice trembling slightly into the makeshift microphone, "you know that for months we've been working to restore our old locomotive and revive part of our railway. What many don't know is that we only have 6 weeks to prove that our project is viable, or we'll lose everything." A murmur ran through the crowd. Michael continued, explaining about the construction company's proposal, the deadline given by the railway company, and the technical and financial challenges they still faced. "I'm not going to lie to you," he said, looking directly at the people who were there. "It's a nearly impossible task. We would need at least $20,000 to complete the locomotive restoration, make the necessary track repairs, and present a convincing technical project. That's a lot of money for a town like ours." "How much do we already have?" someone shouted from the back. $8,400, Michael replied, "thanks to the events we've held, and the donations we've received." The ensuing silence was heavy. $20,000 was indeed a lot of money for that community, where most people lived on small pensions, subsistence farming, or local commerce. But then Jed stood up. "Michael, I can donate 500 more hours of free work at the workshop, and I have some parts saved that might work." Helen was next. "I can organize a course on local history, and charge a small fee, and I have some old books I can sell." Miss Anna stood up. "The school can organize more events, and my students can do an online campaign to publicize the project." Then something happened that Michael would never forget. One by one, dozens of people stood up, offering what they could. Mrs. Mary offered her chickens' eggs to sell. Mr. Joseph offered to donate wood from his sawmill. Lucia, the seamstress, offered her services to make project t-shirts to sell. Anthony, the barber, said he would donate the earnings of 1 workday per week. When the accounting was done at the end of the meeting, they had almost everything they needed, not in cash, but in labor, materials, services, and small donations. It was as if the whole town had decided, at that moment, that the railway was worth saving. But the most important thing happened 3 days after that meeting. Robert Miller showed up again at Michael's house, but this time he wasn't alone. With him came Sandra, the architect, and 2 other people Michael didn't know. "Mr. Michael," Robert said, and for the first time his voice didn't have that superior tone, "we'd like to make a proposal." Michael invited them in, served coffee, and waited. "After the meeting at the school, we learned about the deadline you have, and we also learned about the support the community is giving to the project," Robert continued. "We talked to our investors, and we came to a conclusion." Michael waited, not knowing what to expect. "How about we form a partnership?" "What do you mean?" Sandra spoke. "We can modify the mall project, include space for the train station, create a themed commercial area around the historic railway. The mall would have fewer stores, but it would gain a unique selling point in the region. Michael was silent, processing the proposal. And you would be willing to finance the restoration of the locomotive? Part of it, Robert replied. In exchange for a partnership in the tourist exploitation of the project. It was tempting, very tempting. It meant that the project would be viable, that the locomotive would be saved, that the community would have both the historic railway and jobs at the mall. It seemed like the perfect solution, but Michael asked for a week to think. And during that week he did something he considered fundamental. He talked again with the entire community. 2 weeks earlier, "I don't trust them," said Jed, fiddling with a wrench in his hands. A businessman who changes his mind like that, from 1 hour to the next, has ulterior motives. But Jed, it would be a guarantee that the project would succeed, argued Miss Anna, the teacher. And it would bring development to the town. Development controlled by them, not by us, retorted Helen. Michael, you've known these people for months. What's your heart telling you? Michael was divided. The partnership proposal would solve all the financial problems, but something bothered him. Maybe it was the way Robert had completely changed his tune. Maybe it was the feeling that, by accepting the partnership, they would be handing over control of the project to people who didn't share the same values. The answer came from an unexpected source. During one of the last work sessions on the locomotive, which was almost ready thanks to Jed and the volunteers' efforts, one of the children who used to follow the work asked a simple question. "Michael, if these businessmen are in charge of the railway, will we still be able to come here to play?" The child's question hit the heart of the matter. The project had been born from the community's desire to preserve its history and keep alive an important part of its identity. If they handed over control to third parties, even with good intentions, would it still be the same project? Michael made his decision that afternoon. He sought out Robert and refused the partnership proposal. "Nothing personal, Mr. Robert, but this project needs to remain community-owned." Robert didn't like the answer. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Michael. Alone, you won't succeed, and when you fail, there will be no second chance." Maybe Robert was right. Maybe they were doomed to fail. But Michael had learned, over those months, that some battles are worth fighting, even without a guarantee of victory. 1 week earlier, the final week before the deadline, was intense. The locomotive was working. Jed had managed the miracle of making the old engine purr again. The tracks had been repaired on a 2-kilometer stretch. The technical project was ready, prepared by a retired engineer who volunteered to help, but they were still short $3,000 to complete the amount needed to present to the railway company. Then something nobody expected happened. The story of the little train from Havenwood had spread on social media, shared by Miss Anna's students. A travel blogger from a nearby town wrote about the project. A regional radio station interviewed Michael, and donations started arriving from completely unexpected places. $50 from a retiree from another town who remembered the train from his childhood. $100 from a family that wanted to support the preservation of history. $20 from university students who found the project inspiring. When Michael counted the money on the eve of the deadline, they had exactly what they needed. Not a cent more, not a cent less. But the final test was yet to come. To prove to the railway company that the project was viable, they needed to make the locomotive travel the 2 kilometers of repaired tracks, demonstrating that everything worked perfectly. The final day, the day of the demonstration, dawned cloudy, with the threat of rain. Michael woke up early, nervous as he hadn't been in a long time. Everything depended on that day. If the locomotive worked perfectly, if the tracks held up, if there were no technical problems, they would have saved the railway. Otherwise, it would all have been in vain. Michael carefully folded the letter and put it away. At 62, he had discovered that his life was only beginning a new phase, and who knows how many other forgotten locomotives were waiting in lost corners of the country for someone who believed they still had stories to tell. That night, before bed, Michael went out to the porch and looked toward the station. He couldn't see it in the dark, but he knew it was there, alive again, full of possibilities. And tomorrow, as he had every day for the past 6 months, he would wake up early, have his coffee, and walk over there, not because he was clinging to the past, but because he had helped build a bridge between the past and the future. The distant whistle of a freight train passing on the main line echoed in the night, like a farewell greeting. Michael smiled and murmured to himself, "See you tomorrow, Ben-Hur," affectionately referring to the locomotive, named in honor of the horse from the story Helen had told the children. Another courageous soul who had found hidden treasures when no one else believed they existed. And that's how Michael Santos, a simple retired engineer, learned that life's true railroad isn't made of tracks and locomotives, but of human connections, shared dreams, and the courage to believe that even when everything seems lost, there's always one last chance to make a difference. Because sometimes, what seems to be the end of the line is just the beginning of a new journey, and the best trains are those that carry not just passengers, but hopes, memories, and the certainty that when a community unites for a common purpose, there's no track that can't be repaired, no machine that can't be restored, and no dream that's impossible to realize. The story of Havenwood became a legend in the region. Visitors came from afar to see the small town that had resurrected its railroad through the strength of community unity, and always, at the end of their visit, they left with a lesson they took to their own towns, their own struggles, their own seemingly impossible dreams, that true strength lies not in money or power, but in a person's ability to believe in something bigger than themselves, and to get other people to believe too. Michael Santos had begun his journey as a lonely man trying to save some rusty tracks. He ended as a living symbol that it's never too late to make a difference, and that the greatest miracles happen not when one person changes the world, but when one person gets other people to change the world together. And every morning, when the little locomotive's whistle echoed across the fields of Havenwood, it was as if the very earth breathed again, reminding everyone who had witnessed that story that there is always hope, always a possibility of a new beginning, always a train waiting to take us back home.